Erich Fromm, a German philosopher, wrote that love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. It is an attitude, an ordination of character which determines the relatedness of the person to the whole world as a whole, not toward one object of love. I feel that he's talking about a sense of love and faith that is out of line with romanticism, which is pervasive in most Western Christian cultures, through things like advertising and even ideologies held thereof. The contrast between Erich Fromm's sense of love and faith, which is existential, and romanticism, is that romanticism is impractical and leads to an inflation of existential loneliness. And all humans are at one point lonely. Even in successful relationships, which is why romance is not a good template for either love or faith. Even when we have no reason to live existentially, we must understand that we will come to a reason through experience and acceptance of existential angst. Romance dictates that love and faith are unanimously sexual. Also, from the romantic viewpoint, sex is considered the ultimate expression of human love and faith towards beauty, which is a conditional sector of creation, which in Christian theology is made by God, and loving only part of God's creation with intolerance to other parts leads to an idea of perfection worship, which takes the place of God, whereas God is perfect in his love, because that love is unconditional to all creation. Not all creation we as humans see as beautiful, but most Christians would agree that God sees all creation as beautiful rather than valuing one creation over another. And they refer to this as a love resonant of the love of a father to his children. So, what is the difference between existential love and faith and romantic love and faith? The difference is that romance is conditional on objectification of whom we love to what we love, and romantic love and faith are conditionally based in material existence and conditional love, whereas love is in a romantic's eyes conditional solely upon the achievement of sexual conquest, which is emphasized in Western culture, quite amorally to the women and men who are being objectified, and on the basis of those being desensitized by that objectification. Alternatively, existential love and faith are unconditional and beyond the material. Existential love and faith are comparatively more indicative of a Judeo-Christian God. As well, Fromm, in quote, notifies us, even in his time, to the idea of the objectification of whom we love to what we love. And as a precursor, he warns us of this romantic love and faith which reduces a person to a thing, now prevalent in all Western cultures. The ideology of objectification, which replaces love, is by nature harsh and very difficult to purge from the set of modern and secular Western cultures, including those that are monotheistic and or Christian. By contrast, the ordination of character, which Fromm refers to in relation to the world of creation as a whole, is also a precursor of another more necessary idea for the reform of Western Christian theology. Back to an unconditional form of love, the basis of such an idea is that core values which we hold determine our relationship to existential creation and potentially God, such that the nature of that relationship is either good or bad. And we have the free will to make such choices throughout and because of our existence. Free will is essential to being Christian and primarily Catholic, but also to humanity, whether that humanity is secular or not secular. I feel that it is necessary to understand that love is a series of continuous, intentional, and heartfelt actions from which we mutually learn and teach. And that view of love as mutual education is in direct parallel with faith in Christian theology, and specifically the process for the ordination to religious vocations, or any vocation such that one could say that it does not matter whether one is ordained for a vocation, institutionally religious or not, that determines whether you belong in that vocation, but rather what determines whether, for instance, someone should be a priest or not, or lawyer, or even a construction worker, for instance, is ordination of character, primarily, whereas character is inherent in the person's core values or soul. But neither the dogma of the church nor the requirements of a college degree or the laws of a government is inherent in who we are, and therefore cannot claim to qualify us as being what we are. Of a government is inherent. Wrong line. Of what we are as people, first and foremost, in the eyes of a monotheistic God. And this is inclusive in the sacrament of marriage, regardless of assigned faith. Any man-made or human-controlled form of institutional ordination is secondary to our core values, which are primarily what defines us by the law and will of God. But the will and law of man are by nature conditional, and therefore not the law of God unanimously. Ordination of character, which Erich Fromm is speaking of, is unconditional to the personal problems we hold, including loneliness and existential angst. But that does not mean that sacraments, such as marriage, are not necessary forms of secondary love to the priesthood, whereas a man who is a priest can in his heart solely wish to be a priest, if that is what he holds as his ordination of character. And God has ordained above the church that he should both marry and be a priest unanimously. So if he also wishes to be married, that too is in alignment with the will of God. And marriage itself is not without times of loneliness or existential angst, which are trials brought upon us by our weaknesses to follow God's will. There is no singularity-focused affection that is the necessary limit of love and faith in the eyes of God, but rather affection for all creation, inordination of character. God's love is not obsessive, but universal and unconditional in Catholicism. The Church of Men feels, however, that in order to be devoted to God to the extent of the priesthood would mean that God claims dogmatically through the Church that this excludes other forms of love. But are not other forms of love gifts from the Holy Spirit given by God through the process of creation? Therefore, should not those forms of love remain available as sacraments in addition to the priesthood? So for the Catholic Church to limit priests to the sole affection to God as a devotion creates dogma which is contradictory by nature to the aims of the vocation of the priesthood, which is primarily an ordination not by dogma but by God's will. The will of God is present as an ordination of character in the priest's core values, and if meaningful to the priest who is ordained to interpret the will of God, then also that is the will of God as it pertains to alternate forms of love and sacrament. Such devotion, if only ordained by the institution of the Church, is false in the eyes of God, if not reflected in the parts of that individual's character which is God-given. As well, all priests are men, and all men are sinful in the eyes of God. And therefore church dogma denotes lust as a sin, and physical intimacy is a human drive inherently distinguishable from the sin of lust, and therefore by contrast potentially God-given. If physical love is inherent through creation and distinguishable from non-inherent lust, then physical love is a God-given law of human creation, which is primary dogma comparative to church dogma, which is secondary and therefore subject to the vices of the men who create that secondary dogma. This being especially so in that we are made in His image according to Catholicism. Such denotation of primary and secondary dogma is distinguishable because what is from creation is from God, and that we are as humans made after His image, but also we are inherently sinful in our own self-governance, as we are subject to vices that makes any man-made or run institution potentially secondary to God's will. And such laws of those institutions do not primarily come from God, always, even if that institution is initially from God. Being inherently sinful is not denoted biblically as being inherent from a God who made us in His image, but rather sin is inherent as something ordained by a man because of man's weakness to vices rather than by the strength of God's will in us, which is not subject to vices. And as such, we will struggle to follow God no matter what we do. We cannot assume that physical love can be in any way not inherent in all of humanity by the will of God, even if church dogma disagrees, because the very nature of life is to be physically intimate, not simply for physical reproduction, but also for the sharing of emotion, and as a value that is core to humanity. Physical love is very indicative of what is inherent in God's law, as God's law is passed to us as creation, which happens to also be one role of physical intimacy. Although I would have supposed that most Christians would agree that lust is sinful in the eyes of God, by comparison to intimacy, the need for physical intimacy is a drive very much so potentially inherent through creation, which is primary to our humanity and therefore a Christian God. So are not all Catholically ordained inherently sinful and subject to lust and human error, but also subject to a God-given natural drive for not only intimacy with God, but the physical intimacy of a relationship if in alignment with their creation by God? The Catholic Church is made of such people, regular people, and if man is subject to that need as denoted by God's will, regardless of man-made law and institutions, then should the sacrament of marriage not be seen by the Church as not simply an alternative to the priesthood, but also as a secondarily ordained sacrament, ordained by God but not the Church, whereas God is more paramount than the Church as dogma is concerned, such that marriage as a sacrament should, if in the heart of the person ordained for the priesthood by the Church, also be an addition, but secondary to the sacrament of the priesthood, whose primary focus is God.